There was a little community newsletter which had a humorous piece about how children view property ownership. It includes lines like this: "If I was holding it 5 minutes ago, it's mine. If I think it's mine, it's mine. If it looks just like one that's mine, it's mine." And so on. The list was a lot longer, but you get the idea. In James 4, 1 through 2, we read these words: "Those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? Do they not come from your cravings that are at war within you? You want something and do not have it, so you commit murder. You covet something and cannot obtain it, so you engage in disputes and conflicts." Sounds a little like the children in that article. If I think it ought to be mine, it's mine. Sounds a lot like the last two of the 10 Commandments about coveting. Once, many years ago, there was a regular column in the newspaper by the evangelist Billy Graham. And in one of those columns, someone had written to him about a feeling of distance from God. And Billy Graham's answer was very simple, and when you think about it, it was really very obvious. He wrote, "Draw near to God, and God will draw near to you." If God feels far away, in other words, go to the places where you last encountered God, where you know God's presence can be felt. Do the things that move you toward God. Hang out with the people who bear God in their lives. Worship, word, sacrament, hymns, prayer, the church, the fellowship of believers. Draw close to God. Fill your life and your mind and your heart and your interactions with coveting God's way, and there will not be room left for coveting your own way. Could it possibly be that simple and that obvious? Actually, my friends, I think so. Now remember that simple does not necessarily equate to easy, however. We're destined for a lifelong struggle between our human desires and our call in Christ. If you or I want to become more godly, what we need to do is to go and do and be with those things and those people who are godly. For example, listen to this story of two old monks who lived together in the desert for many years. They decided that they should try to have an argument, like the rest of humankind. So one asked the other how to do it. And he replied, "I will put something on the floor and say, 'It's mine.' And then you say, 'No, it's mine.' And then we'll argue about it." Good plan. "All right," responded the first monk. So the other did as was planned and said, "It's mine." And the first monk said, "All right, have it." That was the end of their argument. They had spent so much time in the presence of God and of one another that their natural instinct was to behave in this way. It may not be so for most of us, but we certainly can aspire to it. That's why God calls us together into the community of the church. In some ways, we might refer to the church as Sinners Anonymous. In our weekly meeting, we confess our addiction and lean upon one another who are in the same predicament to keep us working the healthy, holy program. It's how Christians keep Christ focused in a culture that is at best nominally Christian and at worst hostile. That's why the community that we call the church, our regular participation in it, is so important, so indispensable. There's no mystery here, no magic. Wander from God, from God's way, from God's Son, and disaster will follow you. Draw near to God, to God's way, to God's Son, and no matter what happens, peace and harmony will follow you. Today is Pledge Sunday in our church, when we bring our commitments to the church to offer to God. Those of you who may not have had brought with you your pledge card, I will let you know that Richard Woodholm has some with him and will gladly share them with you. If you have brought that, wonderful, and if you have not today and are not prepared to do that, do it another week. But today we will dedicate them. There was a successful entrepreneur named Bob Buford who sums up his philosophy of giving with this one line: I want to bounce my last check. We know that bouncing checks is not really a good idea. But as a response to Jesus' reminder that we are not taking it with us, bouncing the last check is a symbol that we've passed along all the good gifts that we've received from God. So perhaps we could have a Christian bumper sticker that reads, "The one who bounces the last check wins," meaning that we have given it all away. Zacchaeus, the tax collector, had accumulated much, but he recognized the holy in Jesus. He could not be in the presence of Jesus without being moved to make right what was wrong in his life. He was a tax collector. He had taken advantage of many people, lied to them, swindled to them, skimmed the top off his collections. And beyond all this, he had ignored the poor. Let's listen to his story, thanks to Reverend David Leininger, and thanks to Bob Piccone, from Zacchaeus' perspective.
I used to wish I were tall. All the other children were bigger. They were stronger, faster. I was a shrimp. And it used to bother me. I used to lie in my bed at night wishing that I was the biggest kid in town. Then nobody would push me around. No one calls Zacchaeus names, at least not if they wanted to keep their teeth. None of them would ever give me any trouble again. Yeah, I wanted to be tall. But as time went along, of course, I stopped worrying about it too much. As we get older, we learn to stop being concerned about things over which we have no control. Anyway, whenever those old dreams about being tall would glance across my mind, I would content myself with thinking, it doesn't matter. When I sit on top of my money, I am the tallest man in Jericho. Ha! Yes, I do have some money. I admit that it might not have been obtained in the most upright of fashions, but we tax collectors don't make our living by being particularly upright. And I know that it at least part of the reason that people have hated me, they have thought I got my money dishonestly. Well, perhaps yes, and perhaps no. But they know how it works. If tax collectors took only what was due the emperor, we would have nothing for ourselves. I sometimes wonder whether these people of Israel would rather have a Roman come around to collect the monies rather than one of their own. Another Jew, at least another Jew, is going to have some feeling for his own people. A Roman would not have that. I have to admit that it probably went into tax collecting. I probably went into tax collecting business for more than just the money. In a way, I probably to get back at some of my wonderful neighbors, the ones who taunted me and bullied me when I was growing up. If I had been a little taller back then, they might have left me alone. But I wasn't, and they didn't. So when I became old enough to make a career for myself, tax collecting didn't seem like such a bad idea. I could make a pile of money and stick it to my so-called friends at the same time. I didn't have to worry about how tall or short I was, because if anyone gave me any trouble, I could call my tallest Roman legionnaire in Jericho to back me up. Short doesn't matter when you have two very tall protectors. Of course, outside of tax collecting, it still matters sometimes. It mattered this morning. Word had come that this incredible teacher, about whom the whole nation had been talking, this Jesus of Nazareth, was coming through town. Now, I admit that I have never been the most religious of men. I'm a Jew, but I would confess that I am not the most devout Jew who ever lived. Far from it, actually. But I was curious about this rabbi. I had heard of some tremendous things he had done, healing the sick, restoring sight to the blind, making the lame to walk. Who wouldn't be curious about someone like that? I wanted to see him. Apparently, half the people in Jericho felt the same way. They were all gathered around the road, waiting for Jesus to pass by. That was when being short mattered again. I couldn't see. The crowd was too dense. No one would let me through to the front. And when they saw who it was who was trying to get past, they crowded in all the closer. I wish I had been taller. Finally, I got fed up. There was no way I could fight the mob. And if I had stayed where I was, I would have seen nothing. So I went down the road a piece and climbed a tree, a sycamore, that stood right by the wayside. True, it had been years since I had climbed a tree. I'm probably lucky that I didn't fall and break my neck. But I perched myself up there and thought, ha! I'm the tallest man in Jericho now. It wasn't long before Jesus came. He was surrounded by a mob, folks crowding in, hanging on his every word. I really couldn't hear him very well until Jesus and the crowd got right near to me and my sycamore. What happened next? I will never be able to explain. If I lived to be older than Methuselah, I would never be able to explain it. As the group made their way under my precarious perch, Jesus stopped. He looked up at me and said, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your home today." I could hardly believe my ears. He knew my name. Who would have told him? And stay at my house? The house of a tax collector? Someone who was hated by everyone, that they shouldn't even let me get a glimpse of him until I climbed that tree? Jesus was coming home with me? Incredible. Needless to say, I hurried down and stood there right next to this fantastic man. No longer did I have to stretch and strain just for a glimpse of him. He was right next to me. I admit, I felt pretty tall. Within a short time, we had arrived at my home. My mind was still reeling at the fact that this famous stranger had invited me to dinner, even if it was my own home. We made our way through the open courtyard and came into the house, leaving the heat of the crowd and midday desert sun behind us. My wife and servants had already heard we were coming because word went around Jericho like wildfire. But at a moment like this, I didn't care what people thought. Rotten? Little? It didn't make any difference. I was about to eat with Jesus, and somehow that seemed to make everything in my life all right. As we dined together, it became apparent to me that there was nothing I could hide from this man. He knew me inside and out, seemingly better than I even knew myself. I wondered why he would want to spend time with me, but he said something to me that I didn't understand at first. But now that I have made time to reflect on it, I think I know what he meant. He said, "The Son of Man came back and to save what was lost." Let me explain what happened. By the time our meal was over, I was convinced that I had been wrong in what I had been doing all these years. Not the tax collecting, because somebody has to collect the taxes. There was nothing inherently wrong with being a tax collector. No, what I had done wrong was to seriously overcharge people, to cheat them for my own gain. It was stealing, pure and simple. And our law says, thou shalt not steal. So I stood up beside the table and said that I was going to make restitution. I would return all that I had taken illegally and pay a 300% interest penalty. I also realized that I could and should do more to help those in Jericho who were less fortunate than I. So I said I would give half my goods to the poor. I had plenty. I could afford it. Then I sat down. There was a kind of stunned speechlessness in the room. Everyone just looked at me. Here was that old thief, Zacchaeus, saying something that was so incredibly out of character, and no one could react to it, could react in any way other than astonished silence. I really felt good about myself at that moment. Better than I had in years. It was almost as if a great weight had been lifted from me. I had done something actually good, and without even being forced. Jesus didn't make me do what I did, but somehow just eating with him made me want to do right. That's when he said what he did, and about seeking and saving the lost. I was lost in my own interest, my own greed, my own self-pity. Then down the dusty road came Jesus. He looked up at me on that sycamore branch and invited me to dinner with him. Suddenly, little lost Zacchaeus had been found, and I will never be little or lost again.
So you see, Zacchaeus discovered that stewardship is much more than just something we do once a year when we decide how much money to give to the church. Stewardship is a way of living in grateful response for all that God has entrusted to us. Today we will dedicate the pledges we bring for the work of this church in 2017. I invite us to understand those pledges as part of our grateful response to God's grace for us. As important as it is to raise the church budget as part of our response to the grace of God, that's not all there is to financial stewardship. The goal of stewardship only begins with meeting the church budget. The goal of stewardship, as we've talked about, is spiritual growth. The goal is growth in caring for all that is entrusted to us. Stewardship is a question of whom we will serve and how. It's a matter of accountability.